So, time to talk about another console I never thought I'd be covering until I possibly decided to do one of these retrospectives on the Pokemon series or something. By the way, I have no plans to do one for Pokemon, so don't expect it. Anyway, my original plan wasn't to really cover these games, but I figured I would cover them anyway since I'm going to be covering Mega Man 5 on the Game Boy, as well as Mega Man in Base and Mega Man 10. All three of which feature stuff from Dr. Wily's Revenge up to Mega Man 4 for Game Boy. There's not really much to cover on these games initially, other than two major details. One now, and one later. The one right now is that this game, as well as the rest of the Game Boy games, was not developed by Capcom. Instead, the Game Boy games were outsourced to two specific companies, with this one being outsourced to Minakuchi Engineering, who also helped to make the Wily Wars and the Game Boy port of Bionic Commando. There's not really much else on them, however. I know they also worked a bit on Mega Man X3 and a Super Nintendo port of a game called Magic Sword, but there's not much info I could find on them. In fact, the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis are the most recent consoles they've supposedly worked on, so perhaps they've gone bankrupt or something. Either way, let's get started on the game and see what's in store for us. So the story for this game isn't really much. It's basically just that Dr. Wily is seeking revenge. Okay, not really much of a story. When we start the game, we're given a downgrade to the number of robots, having to deal with 4 of the original bots rather than all 6. No Bomb Man or Guts Man for this one. I originally started off trying to go after Cut Man, but his stage is brutal. So after that didn't work out, I went after Fireman instead. Fireman's stage is pretty accurate to his stage in the NES version, since there wasn't really much of a change. Then again, the issue with this game is that I barely remembered things that happened in its levels. That's how little of an impact they were. They're not really that memorable. All I remembered is that they were difficult. I do remember some of the gimmicks and some things that happened in each stage that I had to deal with. Cutman's level can be pretty frustrating. He has this new enemy called Cutting Wheel that's a giant saw blade with eyes that'll sometimes chase after you and sometimes won't. His stage has a lot of enemies that take a crap ton of shots to kill. A Legman's stage doesn't really have enemies, but instead replaces it with obstacles, including these small fans that screw with your momentum ever so slightly. And Iceman's stage features these ice blocks that melt if you're on them for too long, as well as these icicles that are platforms, but will kill you instantly if they hit you from above. So of course you have to carefully use them to cross to a ladder. The bosses aren't really that different from the original game either. Fireman still launches fire at you, though only one shot of it with no flame where you were standing because Game Boy limitations. Electman is still annoyingly fast and you can't exploit him. Cutman is still easily exploitable, although by the time you actually reach him you might not have that many lives or that much health, so you might be in trouble there. And Iceman's attacks are still annoying to avoid. So really there are no differences there. This time around the game does tell you what weapons you get for beating bosses, so that's handy. They did change the weakness order around slightly, however, and made Cutman weak to the Firestorm since Bombman and Gutsman aren't in the game to have them be in their proper spots. And of course, once you beat all 4, you move on to Wily's stages. Sort of. See, there is somewhat of a stage here, but it's not a long one. There are plenty of enemies here to deal with, but that's not the highlight of this level. Near the very end of the stage, you're put into a teleporter room with 4 teleporters, but instead of going after the Mega Man 1 bosses that we fought, you're instead forced to fight Flashman, Quickman, Bubbleman, and Heatman, allowing you to gain access to their weapons. Quickman is still rather annoying, Flashman's about the same difficulty, Heatman is definitely as easy as before, and Bubbleman, well, the quick boomerang makes quick work of him. God damn it, I just realized that's a pun. But even that's not the end of the bosses in this stage, as at the end of the stage, you have to fight Wily's newest creation, the Mega Man killer named Anchor. Remember how I said at the beginning of these retrospectives that the characters were named after musical terms? Beat should be obvious, Protoman's Japanese name, ironically, is blues, and Anchor here is named after enka, a Japanese musical style that takes after various Western song genres. I guess that kinda makes sense for Anchor here. While enka is reflective of Western styles of music, Anchor can use his javelin to absorb your attacks and reflect them back as a beam. The downside for him is that doing this attack damages him, and this is one of the few times you can hit him. He's also very easy to get hit by, so you have to play carefully, especially since he doesn't really telegraph if he'll run or jump. After you beat Anchor, you get his weapon, the Mirror Buster, which places a barrier in front of you that drains energy, but it'll block projectile attacks and reflect damage. After that, you still have one level left to go in the form of Wily Space Station. Yeah, it's only one level, but it's pretty difficult from what I remember. Yeah, this game is surprisingly hard. Like, just as hard as the first game, or maybe even harder. Once you get to the end, you have to fight a Wily machine as per usual. This Wily machine's first phase can be a bit annoying. He'll throw the cutter wheel enemies from Cutman's stage at you, and they're annoyingly difficult to dodge. This phase's weak spot is the weird mouth area. Hit it a few times with the atomic fire, and you're good to go. The second phase has a claw that can take a decent chunk out of your health, and will fire these projectiles at you. Reflect them with the Mirror Buster, and the Wily machine will take damage. You need to lead the Crab Claw in order to get it to stop hitting you, but it's easier said than done. Eventually, Wily machine will be destroyed and Wily will grovel before you. The base then begins to explode, but Mega Man, and possibly Wily, make it out safely via space shuttles of sorts. Then we see a list of all the enemies, and then a thank you for playing. Overall, Dr. Wily's Revenge is a decent game. It's challenging, but can be very fun. My biggest problem is that a lot of the stages feel too long, and are too forgettable, and some of the boss fights can be a massive pain still. I do like Anchor, however. Keiji Inafune, who has mostly just been redesigning fan submissions for Robot Master since Mega Man 2, really did a good job making a completely original character in Anchor. He's probably my favorite of the Mega Man killers, just for having such a unique weapon and having a far more regal design than the other three. This was another short game to cover, but I feel like this was long enough to make into its own video. The next three should be the same, and I know the last of the Game Boy games definitely will be. But the next one... oh boy, do we have something to talk about with that one. Join me next time as we cover the odd one out of the Mega Man Game Boy games, Mega Man 2 for Game Boy. I'm going to be saying that a lot, aren't I? Probably going to be hammered in after a while.
Pah! Anchor was worthless! I should have known he wouldn't have stood up to Mega Man. But you will be a far more worthwhile adversary.
Don't worry, I'll show him what the future holds in store before I crush him to bits.